In the late 1800s, Santa Cruz County's most important industry was logging, but second was the manufacturing of lime. This is a short overview of the history of the lime industry in Santa Cruz County. If you're interested in more information, take a look at the book Lime Kiln Legacies. If you hike around in the hills behind Santa Cruz and Felton, once in a while you'll come across outcrops of this white rock. This is called by some people limestone. Other people call it lime rock. If you ask geologists, they will tell you that technically it is marble. Chemically, it's all the same. It's calcium carbonate. And if you heat it in a kiln to about 1700 degrees Fahrenheit or more, it undergoes an interesting transformation. It becomes kind of a chalky white, shrinks to about 80% of its original size, and loses about half its weight. What's happening is that the limestone or marble is converting into lime, calcium oxide. Lime was a very important building material in the late 1800s. It's still used for many different purposes, but in the late 1800s, most of the lime manufactured around Santa Cruz and Felton was used in the construction industry for mixing with water and sand to make mortar and plaster. There are outcrops of marble along three different creeks west of Felton, down near Santa Cruz in the UCSC and Pogonip area, and also on a couple of North Coast creeks and in Bonnie Doon. Not surprisingly, if you're looking for old historic lime kilns, that's exactly where you will find them. Along Fall Creek, Bennett Creek, and Bull Creek, west of Felton, and south in the UCSC area. The kilns on San Vicente Creek and Liddell Creek are no longer standing. As this quote from the State Mining Bureau of 1884 indicates, Santa Cruz was one of the most important lime-producing areas in California at that time. There were three reasons for this. One, the stone was of very good quality for making lime. It was almost pure calcium carbonate, around 96-98%. There was plenty of forest lands to provide fuel for the kilns, and it was fairly close to the principal market, which was San Francisco. In the old days, you could load a schooner on the wharf at Santa Cruz full of barrels of lime and get it up to San Francisco in about a day and a half. I wanted to take you through the basic steps in the process. This is a scene of the quarry west of Felton, the Holmes Company quarry, back in about 1908. They did a lot of blasting to bring the rock down from the quarry face. Then men would take giant sledgehammers and break it up into chunks about the size of a volleyball. Here's some men loading the rock into an ore car, which is going to go down to the kilns in Felton by gravity. It's on a little rail line. And here's a picture of some of the lime kilns on what's now Heen Street in Felton. These were of an unusual design, and I'll talk more about them later. A lot of the kilns that were used were called pot kilns, also known as batch kilns, because you made one batch of lime at a time in them. This is a view inside one of the pot kilns at UCSC, and it's still partly loaded, has a couple of feet of the rock stacked inside. And you can see the area behind the doorway there going into the kiln was not filled with rock. It was left open. They would gradually stack the rock up until they got above the doorway and then create an arch and bring the rock together and then fill the kiln all the rest of the way to the top, all the way across. These open areas were temporary fire boxes where during the burn they would toss in the pieces of redwood for fuel. This is a lime kiln at what's now Wilder Ranch, and this kiln was never fired. It was loaded, and it's still loaded, but was not fired. So it's a wonderful chance to look inside and see the arch and see the size of the firebox. Here's an artist's conception of what it would look like to open the door of one of the kilns while it was being fired. They had double doors on the front of this one, and they could use those to control the draft. They used redwood for fuel, 8-foot long split redwood, and it took anywhere from 75 to 150 cords of wood for a single burn. Tremendous amount of wood. Of course, much more redwood was cut for the logging industry, but the lime industry also had a major impact on the local forests. Supposedly, they used a lesser quality wood for the lime kilns. This is a famous picture taken at what's now UCSC by the lime kilns. You can see the workers standing next to the barrels of lime. It took about 2 days to load a kiln, 5 days for the burn, 2 days for it to cool, and 2 days to unload the kiln. This is a fabulous old photograph taken in 1866, showing what's now the entrance to UCSC, believe it or not. Here you can see the old cooperage on the left where the barrels were made, and a big load of lime barrels on a wagon being pulled by oxen. The oxen would take the lime to a wharf in Santa Cruz, where it was then loaded onto ships. The lime companies in Felton in the early days had a problem. They weren't nearly as close to the wharf, so they had to haul the lime by wagon all the way from Felton to Santa Cruz, and the roads were not very good in the 1850s and 1860s. In the mid-1870s, fortunately for them, a narrow gauge railroad was established between Santa Cruz and Felton, called appropriately the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad. Here you see one of the narrow gauge locomotives getting ready to pull a load of lime from the kilns in Felton. By the time this picture was taken in the 1880s, it was owned by the South Pacific Coast Railroad, and you can faintly see the SPC on the side of the fuel car. And here's an early view of 2 wharves in Santa Cruz. In the distance is the Cowell Wharf, which the Cowell Company used. And in the foreground is the railroad wharf that was built originally by the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad and stood up until the early 1920s. The current municipal wharf would be just a little bit in front of that railroad wharf. The railroad actually drove out onto the wharf so that the lime and other products could be loaded directly onto ships. Here's an early picture of the railroad wharf. At the time this photo was taken, it had a railroad on it, railroad line for both narrow gauge and standard gauge. You can see the 3 rails there. This is a view at the Cowell Wharf. We don't know for sure if those are barrels of lime, but being that it's the Cowell Wharf, they most likely are. Lime workers. The lime industry employed a lot of laborers for all the different tasks in making the lime. quarrying the rock and loading the kilns and making the barrels and so forth. These are some of the workers at the Holmes Company in Felton in about 1908. And here's some at what were called the Cowell Upper Kilns, also in the very early 1900s, maybe around 1903 or 1904. A lot of the workers were recent immigrants to the United States. In the early days, a lot of them were Irish, and later on, many of them were Italian or Portuguese from the Azores. There were about 25 different lime companies in Santa Cruz County over the years, some of them with multiple owners. But the best known name today, of course, is that of Henry Cowell, primarily because of the park that is named after him. And there's also Cowell College at UCSC. Cowell came to California during the gold rush. He grew up in Massachusetts. Came during the gold rush, and at first had a business hauling and warehousing in San Francisco. He also did a lot of money lending, and that's how he got involved with the lime making in Santa Cruz. He loaned money to the firm of Davis and Cowell to help them out with their business, the firm of Davis and Jordan. And then when Mr. Jordan got sick and wanted to sell out his half of the business, he sold it to Henry Cowell. That was in 1865. And Cowell lived in Santa Cruz, overseeing operations here from 1865 until the family moved back to San Francisco in 1879. This is Eben Bennett, for whom Bennett Creek in Felton was named. Mr. Bennett was another lime manufacturer in the 1860s and 1870s. And this is Henry Holmes. Henry Holmes later bought the Bennett Lime Works and also the neighboring lime operation owned by Thomas Bull. Holmes started making lime up in the Sierra foothills and later moved his headquarters to San Francisco. He also sold lime in Sacramento. Here you can see an early ad for the Holmes Company, Sacramento and Santa Cruz lime. You'll notice in that ad here it says that he sold hair. A lot of the lime companies sold hair. Plasterers would mix hair with the plaster to add tensile strength to the plaster. So the lime companies had an interesting relationship with tanneries. They would sell the tanneries lime because the tanneries needed lime water to soften the hide so that the hair could be removed. And then after the hair was removed, they would sell the hair back to the lime companies, who would then sell it to plasterers. Still another lime company near Felton was the IXL Lime Company. It went into business in the mid-1870s on Fall Creek. IXL was a term commonly used in those days for different businesses, sort of like Acme. It stood for IXL. Here's an old card from the IXL Lime Company. It was started by several different stockholders, a couple of businessmen in San Francisco, and also several people around Santa Cruz and Felton, including Isaac Blum, who had a general merchandise store in the Flatiron Building in Santa Cruz. And here's one of the kilns at Fall Creek today. If you read the description of the IXL company when it first started up, they had two kilns, one large, one small. Today there are 3 kilns at Fall Creek, all the same size. This is probably because the IXL company went out of business in the mid-1890s, and the property was later purchased by Cowell. Cowell then rebuilt the kilns. If you look at the lime kilns around Santa Cruz County, there are lots of different shapes and sizes. It seems like nobody could figure out what exactly was the best design for a lime kiln. So almost every one is different, except for Cowell. Cowell had the ones he had at the upper kilns at what's now Wilder Ranch, and the ones at the entrance to UCSC, and the ones at Fall Creek are all very, very similar, all built around 1900 or the very late 1890s, and that seems to be a design that he liked. They would have 3 kilns so that if they had a lot of orders, they could have one being loaded, one being fired, and another being unloaded, all at the same time. And here's a view inside one of the kilns at Fall Creek. They almost always built the kilns into a hillside to help support the walls. The only wall that wasn't well supported was the front wall, so they would often add extra braces to that wall, even though the wall was about 6 feet thick. These later kilns were lined with fire brick. You didn't necessarily need to line the kiln with brick, but they did so because the brick would reflect or re-radiate heat back into the kiln. So they were a fuel-saving measure. Fuel was a major cost in the making of lime. These fire bricks usually have names on them. A lot of them at Fall Creek say Snowball. These were, it seems like sort of a strange name for a brick that's supposed to withstand 2,000-degree temperatures, but they're called Snowball bricks because they were made by the Snowball Company, founded by Mr. James Snowball. These bricks were made in northern England near Newcastle and imported here all the way around Cape Horn as ship's ballast. Here's an old kiln door lying on the forest floor. And one of the neat things about the Fall Creek area is that there are still big stacks of the cordwood. For our Lime Kiln Legacies book, Bob Pawarzik, one of my co-authors, seen here, and I went up and measured some of these pieces of cordwood so we could describe them quantitatively in the book. They measure, they're split, and they measure about 2 to 3 inches by 5 to 6 inches by about 8 feet long. Another view of the inside of one of the kilns at Fall Creek. The wood had to be cut just the right length to fill the width of the kiln that you see there. The kilns are about 11 feet wide, but they'd have 2 or 3 feet of rock stacked against the back wall, so that would leave about 8 feet for the piece of wood. There were some other kinds of kilns besides pot kilns. They also used, in later years, continuous kilns. These were designed to save fuel. The pot kilns, you had to heat them up, and then you had to cool them down to unload them, and then you had to load them and heat them up again, so they were not very fuel efficient. Continuous kilns, you dumped the rock in the top, took the finished lime out the bottom, and they could just run continuously for days, weeks, or I suppose even months. We are very fortunate in this county that we actually have one of the old stone continuous kilns still standing near the entrance to UCSC. It was originally a little taller than it is now. I had a chance to examine it up close and measure the inside, and I did this drawing to show how it works. The rock was dumped in at the top, and every time some lime was taken out at the bottom, the entire load would shift downward, bringing the rock into this calcining zone near the fireboxes where it would get turned into lime. They could withdraw some lime every few hours from this kiln. There was still another type of continuous kiln that was used in this county called a monitor kiln. That earlier kiln was built in 1861, just before the Civil War. The monitor kilns were not introduced until the 1870s, and Thomas Bull had one at his lime works on Bull Creek near Felton. Here you can see the kiln in the background, kind of a black Coke bottle affair. It was steel lined with fire brick and then had a stone base. I found one of these kilns still standing quite a number of years ago near Placerville in the Sierra foothills. So it was really fun to get to see one of these up close. I don't know if it's still there, but this is a picture of the draw door where the finished lime was removed. It's very small, only a couple of feet wide. And here are the doors to the fireboxes. The upper door is for putting in the fuel, and the lower one is for removing ashes. And you'll see these little holes in the side. These are peepholes. Because the wall wasn't nearly as thick as with the stone kilns, they could have these little peepholes so they could peer in to see the rock and see if it was properly being converted into lime. In other words, they could monitor the load, hence the term monitor kiln. These Holmes Company kilns, built in the 1880s in Felton, were of still another design. They were steel, partly of stone, lined with fire bricks. And descriptions at the time said that they were of a unique design. They were designed by William Russell, who was the superintendent of the operation. Unfortunately, we don't know too many of the details of just how they worked or what they looked like on the inside. Another view of the same area, the Holmes Lime Company, early 1900s. You can see these round pot kilns in the foreground being loaded, and in the distance is still another type of continuous kiln. Here's a view of the same area in later years after it was abandoned, and a view when it was still being used, again around 1908 or 1909. There you can see a load of rock up top about to be dumped into this continuous kiln, and a couple of men with really long handled shovels for scooping ashes out of the fireboxes. If you want to see better what those kilns looked like, they're not much standing today, but if you go to Lime Kiln State Park south of Big Sur, they have several of them. They're not very far from the parking lot, and you can get a good close-up look. Well, by the early 1900s, the lime companies were getting worried because they'd cut so many trees for fuel that they were running out of wood for fuel. But fortunately, another new energy source came along, something called oil. This is a view of the Rincon lime works, and there you can see some oil tanks in the foreground. Another view of the Holmes Company kilns at Felton around 1908. In the foreground is a load of fire brick. They apparently were getting ready to put new bricks in one of their kilns. And this view is the same location today. This is Heen Street in Felton, and what's left of those kilns form a retaining wall in the backyard of some of the houses there on the left. Again, that's the old picture, and then this is what it looks like today. When we did our book on the history of the lime industry in Santa Cruz County, we titled it Lime Kiln Legacies because there are a lot of legacies of the lime industry. The industry is long gone. The last lime was burned here in 1946, but we have Henry Cowell Redwood State Park, named after an early lime manufacturer. You drive through Felton, you may notice Russell Street, named for William Russell, superintendent of the Holmes Lime Company. And of course, there are the kilns at Fall Creek, at UCSC, and several other locations. In each of these locations, usually the wooden buildings, support buildings like the cabins where the workers lived, or the cookhouse, or the cooperage where they made the barrels, those have disappeared. But the kilns made out of stone have survived. So if you're interested in learning more about the lime industry, the Lime Kiln Legacies book has a lot of information, about 250 pages worth, available on Amazon or in the park at Henry Cowell Redwood State Park, in the park gift shop, Bookshop Santa Cruz, Museum of Art and History, and so forth. If you go to limeworks.ucsc.edu, you can find the website for the Friends of the Cowell Limeworks Historic District on the campus. And there are back issues of Lime Kiln Chronicles newsletter. The newsletter is something I've done for the past 10 years and has a lot of articles with new information that was discovered since the Lime Kiln Legacies book was published in 2007. Some great photographs that have turned up, and also interviews with descendants of some of the lime workers who shared personal stories of their experiences and of their ancestors.